The tension in the Senate Judiciary Committee room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table, her navy blue blazer crisp, her expression calm but determined. Across from her, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk, the same one that infuriated millions during his confirmation hearings. What happened next would send shock waves through Washington and make Crockett a household name overnight. Congresswoman Kavanaugh began, his voice dripping with condescension. Perhaps someone with more experience should be handling constitutional matters of this magnitude. The room fell silent, every phone started recording, and Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver a response that would leave Kavanaugh speechless and have the entire internet talking. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these epic political moments. Now, let's see how Crockett absolutely destroyed Kavanaugh's arrogance. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two people are and why this moment mattered so much. Jasmine Crockett isn't your typical politician. At just 42 years old, she's already made waves as one of the most fearless voices in Congress. A former civil rights attorney from Dallas, Texas, Crockett built her reputation taking on powerful interests and winning. She didn't come from money or political dynasties. She worked her way through law school, spent years fighting for everyday people in courtrooms across Texas, and earned every single thing she achieved. Her journey to Congress wasn't easy or inevitable. Born in St. Louis and raised in a working-class family, Crockett moved to Texas for college and never left. She put herself through the University of Houston Law Center while working multiple jobs, including waiting tables and tutoring other students. After graduation, she could have joined a big corporate law firm and made serious money. Instead, she chose to open her own practice, focusing on civil rights cases that bigger firms wouldn't touch. For over a decade, Crockett represented clients who have been discriminated against in housing, employment, and voting rights. She won case after case against powerful defendants who thought they could outlast or outspend her. Her reputation grew throughout Texas legal circles as someone who would take on anyone, no matter how powerful, if the law was on her side. Her political career began almost by accident. After winning a major voting rights case that protected polling locations in predominantly black neighborhoods, local Democratic leaders started asking her to run for office. She initially said no, preferring courtroom advocacy to political campaigning, but when she saw how many problems required legislative solutions rather than just legal ones, she finally agreed to run for the Texas legislature in 2020. Even in the Texas legislature, Crockett stood out. While other freshman legislators stayed quiet and followed party leadership, she immediately began challenging powerful interests and asking uncomfortable questions. Her legal background made her particularly effective at spotting loopholes in proposed legislation and constitutional problems that others missed. When Crockett speaks, she doesn't use fancy political language or dance around issues. She tells the truth directly and powerfully. That's exactly what made her such a threat to someone like Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh, on the other hand, represents everything wrong with the current system. Appointed to the Supreme Court despite serious allegations and a confirmation hearing that showed his true character, Kavanaugh had spent years making decisions that hurt working families while protecting the wealthy and powerful. His privileged background, elite prep schools, Yale University, handed opportunities at every turn, created a man who looked down on anyone who dared question authority. But here's what made this confrontation so important. This wasn't just about these two individuals. This was about whether someone from Kavanaugh's world of privilege could silence a black woman who had fought her way to Congress. This was about whether the Supreme Court could continue operating without real accountability. And this was about whether Crockett would let Kavanaugh's condescending attitude go unchallenged. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Crockett was testifying about Supreme Court ethics reform proposals that would directly impact Kavanaugh and his colleagues. If she backed down now, it would signal that the court was untouchable. But if she fought back successfully, it could change everything. The committee hearing had started normally enough. Crockett was there to discuss her proposed legislation requiring Supreme Court justices to follow the same ethics rules as other federal judges. It seemed routine until Kavanaugh decided to make it personal. Congresswoman Crockett, Kavanaugh had begun consulting his note to exaggerated importance. "I've reviewed your proposed legislation, and frankly, I'm concerned about whether you fully understand a constitutional separation of powers. Already, you could see where this was heading. The packed committee room filled with reporters, activists, and political observers. Sense attention building, Crockett supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Kavanaugh's allies smiled knowingly. Crockett responded professionally. Justice Kavanaugh, I appreciate your concerns, but I believe the American people deserve transparency from all branches of government, including the Supreme Court. That's when Kavanaugh's mask started slipping. His voice took on that familiar tone, the same one he'd used during his confirmation hearings when he'd been challenged by senators. Well, Congresswoman, he said, practically sneering, constitutional law is quite complex. Perhaps you should consult with more experienced colleagues before proposing such sweeping changes to how the court operates. The room temperature seemed to drop. Several people in the audience gasped audibly. Even some Republicans on the committee looked uncomfortable with Kavanaugh's obvious disrespect. But Crockett didn't flinch. If anything, her posture straightened. She'd been preparing for this moment her entire career. What happened next was what everyone would remember. Kavanaugh, apparently thinking he was winning some kind of debate, decided to go for the kill shot. You know, Congresswoman, I've been studying constitutional law since before you passed the bar exam. Maybe someone with more experience should be handling constitutional matters of this magnitude. This was in a local courthouse in Texas. The insult was clear to everyone in the room. He wasn't just questioning her expertise, he was dismissing her entire background, her intelligence, and her right to be there. The racial and gender undertones were impossible to miss. You could hear a pin drop. Cameras zoomed in on both faces. Crockett's expression remained calm, but her eyes flashed with something that made Kavanaugh's supporters suddenly look nervous. But before Crockett could respond, Kavanaugh made an even bigger mistake. Perhaps emboldened by what he thought was his dominance, he decided to double down. Furthermore, he continued, his voice getting louder. I question whether Congress has any business telling the Supreme Court how to conduct itself. We are a co-equal branch of government, not some lower court that answers to, well, politicians. The pause before politicians was deliberate and insulting. He was trying to diminish not just Crockett but her entire institution. What Kavanaugh didn't realize was that he had just stepped into a constitutional law trap by claiming that Congress had no oversight authority over the Supreme Court. He was making an argument that even conservative legal scholars would reject. The Constitution clearly gives Congress the power to regulate the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, through its authority over judicial budgets, court structure, and impeachment. Several constitutional law professors watching the hearing later noted that Kavanaugh's statement revealed either a troubling misunderstanding of separation of powers or a deliberate attempt to mislead the public about the court's accountability. Professor Jennifer Mason of Georgetown Law would later write, Justice Kavanaugh's claim that Congress has no business regulating Supreme Court ethics would have been laughed out of any first-year constitutional law classroom. But in the moment, Kavanaugh seemed to believe his own rhetoric. He sat back in his chair with visible satisfaction, apparently thinking he had delivered a devastating blow to Crockett's entire premise. That's when something shifted in the room. Even some of Kavanaugh's usual allies started looking uncomfortable. The committee chair, a Republican, actually cleared his throat disapprovingly because Kavanaugh had just made a critical error. He had given Crockett exactly the opening she needed. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her hands folded calmly on the table. The entire room held its breath. Cell phones around the gallery were recording from every angle. This was clearly about to become a moment. Justice Kavanaugh, she began, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made everyone pay attention. I appreciate your perspective on constitutional law. The way she said, perspective, made it clear that something big was coming. Kavanaugh still, apparently thinking he was in control, actually smiled slightly. He had no idea what was about to hit him. Behind Crockett, her legal team exchanged glances. They knew what she was capable of when someone tried to dismiss her credentials. They'd seen her destroy opposing counsel and courtrooms across Texas. When they'd made the mistake of underestimating her. One of her aides, Marcus Williams, who had worked with Crockett for 3 years, later described this moment. I knew Brett Kavanaugh was about to get the full Jasmine Crockett treatment. She gets this look in her eyes when someone tries to talk down to her. It's like watching a chess master who's already seen a checkmate coming in 5 moves. The committee room had transformed into something resembling a gladiatorial arena. Every seat was filled, standing room only stretched along the walls. The press gallery was packed with reporters from every major outlet, their laptops open, fingers ready to live tweet what was clearly about to become a historic moment. Even the usually stoic security guards positioned around the room seemed more alert, sensing the electric tension that was building. One veteran Capitol Hill reporter would later say she'd covered hundreds of committee hearings over 2 decades but had never felt energy like this before. A single response. The stage was set, the audience was primed, and Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver a masterclass in how to shut down institutional arrogance. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media and become required viewing in law schools across the country. Crockett's voice remained perfectly calm, but every word landed like a precision strike. Justice Kavanaugh, since you've decided to question my qualifications, let me help clarify a few things for you and everyone watching. She pulled out a folder that her team had prepared, just in case someone tried exactly this kind of attack. You mentioned that you've been studying constitutional law since before I passed the bar. That's interesting because I passed the bar in 2006, which means you think you've been studying constitutional law since. Well, let's see. You graduated from Yale Law in 1990. So that would be about 16 years. You're claiming the room was dead silent. Even Kavanaugh's smile started to fade. But here's what's really interesting. Justice Kavanaugh, while you were working as a political operative, yes, that's what you were, not a constitutional scholar, investigating President Clinton, and working on Republican campaigns. I was actually in courtrooms defending people's constitutional rights. Crockett opened her folder and began reading from prepared notes. Her legal team had done their homework. Since you brought up experience, let's talk about experience. During my time as a civil rights attorney, I won constitutional cases protecting voting rights, defending free speech, and ensuring equal protection under the law. Real constitutional work in real courtrooms with real consequences for real people. She looked up directly at Kavanaugh, who was now visibly uncomfortable. Meanwhile, your pre-court career was spent doing political opposition research and working for Kenneth Starr. Not exactly constitutional scholarship. Justice Kavanaugh, the audience was starting to murmur with approval. This wasn't just a response, it was a systematic dismantling. But Crockett wasn't done, not even close. But since we're talking about qualifications and experience, Justice Kavanaugh, let's discuss why we're really here today. You mentioned that the Supreme Court shouldn't answer to politicians, but you know what? The Supreme Court should answer to the American people. Her voice began to rise slightly, gaining power. And the American people deserve and know why you've accepted luxury vacations, expensive gifts, and private jet flights without disclosing them. Violations that would get any other federal judge sanctioned or removed. The room erupted, gasps banged as people tried to restore order. Kavanaugh's face had gone red. This was not going the way he'd planned. Crockett waited for quiet, then delivered what would become the most quoted part of her response. You want to lecture me about constitutional law, Justice Kavanaugh? Let me give you a constitutional lesson. Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution, you know, that document you claim to revere, states that civil officers of the United States can be removed from office for high crimes and misdemeanors. She paused, letting that sink in. Taking undisclosed gifts while making decisions that benefit your wealthy friends. That's exactly what the founders had in mind when they wrote those words. Then came the moment that would go viral within minutes. But let's get back to your original point about experience. Justice Kavanaugh, you suggested that maybe someone with more experience should handle constitutional matters. You're absolutely right. Kavanaugh looked confused. Was she agreeing with him? Someone with more experience should be on the Supreme Court. Someone who actually respects the Constitution instead of treating it like a suggestion. Someone who understands that equal justice under law applies to everyone, including Supreme Court justices. Someone who doesn't throw tantrums when asked basic questions about ethics. The reference to his confirmation hearing behavior was unmistakable. The audience was fully engaged. Now, some people standing to applaud. So, here's my question for you, Justice Kavanaugh. If you can't handle basic ethics questions from a congresswoman you think is beneath you, how can the American people trust you to handle the most important constitutional questions of our time? Crockett leaned back in her chair, her voice becoming almost conversational, which somehow made it even more devastating. And one more thing, Justice Kavanaugh. You mentioned this as in a local courthouse in Texas. You're absolutely right. Local courthouse judges in Texas actually follow ethics rules. Maybe you should try it sometime. The room exploded. People were on their feet, applauding. Social media was already lighting up. And Brett Kavanaugh sat there, his mouth slightly open, looking like someone had just slapped him with a constitutional textbook. When the noise died down, Kavanaugh tried to respond. His voice was shaky, his usual confidence completely gone. Congresswoman, the Supreme Court has always maintained its independence. But his words were weak, defensive. The damage was done. He'd walked into that room thinking he could intimidate a freshman congresswoman, and instead he'd been systematically dismantled on live television. We follow appropriate guidelines, he continued, but even he seemed to realize how pathetic it sounded. Crockett simply smiled. I'm sure you do, Justice Kavanaugh. I'm sure you do. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Crockett, calm, prepared, devastating; Kavanaugh, flustered, defensive, defeated. What happened next was unprecedented. The gallery, which included law students, civil rights activists, and everyday Americans who had come to watch the hearing, erupted in sustained applause. People were cheering, clapping, and some were even chanting, "Jasmine! Jasmine!" The committee chair tried to restore order, but the energy in the room was electric. This wasn't just a political moment, it was a cultural moment. A black woman from Texas had just educated a Supreme Court justice about constitutional law and ethics, and everyone knew they'd witnessed something special. Among those in the gallery was Maria Rodriguez, a third-year law student from Howard University, who had driven down from D.C. specifically to watch the ethics hearing. "I've never seen anything like it," she would later tell reporters. Here was a Supreme Court justice trying to intimidate a black woman, and she just dismantled him, piece by piece. I literally got chills when she delivered that line about Texas judges following ethics rules. Also present was retired federal judge Patricia Williams, who had served on the bench for 30 years before stepping down. She was seen nodding approvingly throughout Crockett's response and was overheard telling a colleague, "That's exactly how you handle a bully in Rhodes. I wish more lawyers had her backbone." When I was hearing cases, the sustained applause lasted nearly 2 minutes, an eternity in congressional hearing terms. Security guards, initially concerned about the disruption, found themselves smiling as they watched the organic outpouring of support for Crockett's performance. Even some Republicans on the committee were nodding approvingly, because regardless of party, what they had just seen was a masterclass in preparation, intelligence, and courage. The immediate aftermath of Crockett's dismantling of Kavanaugh was unlike anything Washington had seen in years. Within 15 minutes of the exchange, #Jasmine Crockett was trending #1 on Twitter. The clip of her saying, "Local courthouse judges in Texas actually follow ethics rules, maybe you should try it sometime," had already been viewed over 100,000 times. The meme started immediately. One showed Kavanaugh with the caption, "When you try to mansplain constitutional law to a constitutional lawyer." Another featured Crockett with the text, "That's how you shut down a Supreme Court bully." But it wasn't just jokes. Legal experts were weighing in with serious analysis. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "Congresswoman Crockett just delivered the most effective takedown of judicial arrogance I've ever witnessed. This is what accountability looks like." News networks scrambled to get the story on air. CNN's legal analyst called it a watershed moment for Supreme Court accountability. MSNBC ran the clip on loop, with the headline, "Freshman Congresswoman Schools Supreme Court Justice." Even Fox News, typically supportive of conservative justices, had trouble defending Kavanaugh's performance. One commentator noted that Justice Kavanaugh walked into that room overconfident and left looking like he'd been schooled by someone half his age. The Washington Post editorial board later wrote, "Congresswoman Crockett's response to Justice Kavanaugh demonstrated something we rarely see in Washington anymore: preparation, principle, and a courage to speak truth to power." Within hours, Democratic leaders were rallying behind Crockett. Speaker of the House released a statement. "Congresswoman Crockett exemplified the best of what Congress can be today. Her thoughtful, prepared, and powerful response reminds us why we need more voices like hers in Washington." Progressive organizations immediately started fundraising off the moment Jasmine